Hello, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be discussing the book The Saturday Wife by Naomi Ragen, which I read for the maybe Midrash Readathon, which is hosted by Jason at Old Blues Chapter and Verse. This was the prompt to read a book where religion plays a large role in the plot. I was kind of really disappointed in this book. I've read a number of Ms. Ragen's other books prior, and they're all very, very good. I don't think anyone would ever accuse her of being, like one of the greatest novelists ever to live, but she does write a really good page-turning book, and they does a lot of thoughtful examination of Orthodox women's lives and, the tensions between wanting to be more modern and have a little bit more freedom to do certain things, but not wanting to entirely leave Orthodoxy or Judaism behind. But this book just kind of really failed for me on many levels. There were like barely any sympathetic people editing it all, and I would like to apologize if you hear some of the annoying yard work from the road. I'm sorry about that. And here's the synopsis. Delilah Levy is a social climber who spent her adolescence dreaming of turning her blonde good looks into a brilliant match, as did her mother. But when fate intervenes in the form of a sincere, but not overly bright, rabbinical student, she decides, disastrously, to become the rabbi's wife. Her husband is posted to an affluent suburban, modern Orthodox synagogue, and Delilah befriends the fabulously wealthy Joy Shamanov, who introduces her to a world of material excess that rivals her wildest daydreams. When the demands of a hypocritical board and unbearable congregants finally push her over the edge, the consequences set in motion a social tornado that sweeps everything in its path. And as I mentioned, this book is, it's a synopsis mentioned, this is meant to be a satire, but I did think it was, kind of funny at first, like particularly because Delilah's birth surname is Goldgrab or Goldgrab, so like it's pretty obvious she wants to get, that brass ring and just make money and have a wealthy man. She grew up lower middle class, and she always felt left out and resentful because so many of her privileged peers had things she just couldn't have access to. And I do kind of relate to that. My parents didn't achieve lower middle class status until I was somewhere in my teenage years, and so for example they just couldn't afford a lot of things I really wanted, like particularly a rocking horse that always stayed with me, to the point if I'm ever blessed with children, God willing, I will buy them like the nicest rocking horse I can afford, because that was just something that was always stuck with me as a child, not being able to have all the toys and wonderful things in life I wanted. But Delilah, she just doesn't, oh, okay, this bad thing or disappointing thing happened to me when I was a child and growing up, and I'm going to use it and do things so much better when I'm an adult and make a better life for my children, and not let that keep bugging me and holding a grudge all these years. But she just oh, I'm entitled to all these things because I didn't have them growing up. And I have bookmarked a number of passages in the book. It kind of gives you a taste of the type of satire Ms. Ragen is using. I know she's trying to be funny about a lot of the things, but sometimes it just comes off way too over the top, heavy-handed, hitting the reader over the head with barely any subtlety at all. And Delilah comes across as like a whiny little complainer. She's never satisfied with anything, just so shallow and materialistic. And I do understand that sometimes the point of a character is to be deliberately unlikable or just a difficult, flawed person. But even characters for example, Scarlett O'Hara or Amber St. Clair, we can say, oh, they're not really behaving nicely at all in this point, but at least we can understand what their motivations are, and we run a root for them because they're so resourceful and courageous. They're triumphing over all these terrible odds. But Delilah isn't like that at all. There are only maybe 4 people in the book who are sympathetic at all, but particularly her roommate Rivki, whom she's always borrowing clothes from and conveniently never giving back. And at one point she also says oh, she's have some of the books in her personal library came from the library and she's not giving them back either. And it was interesting, Ms. Ragen name drops one of her own books as one of Delilah's favorite books. And so anyway, here are some of the passages I've marked. The thing people never understood about Delilah was that she always considered herself the victim of a painfully disadvantaged childhood, something that mystified her hard-working, upwardly mobile parents. There were few who knew how deeply she mourned her endless humiliations. Winter clothes chosen from picked-over reduced racks in January sales, instead of shiny new in autumn. A Sweet 16 celebrated in a bowling alley instead of in a hotel with a live band. Passover seders at home prepared by her sweating mother instead of in the dining room of exclusive resorts. Summers lying on the public beach instead of trips to Israel and Europe. A childhood of last year's Nikes, drugstore sunglasses, $15 haircuts, and do-it-yourself French manicures whose white line was always crooked. On the rare occasions that she sat in self-judgment such as before the Yom Kippur fast. She never felt these longings marked her as selfish, materialistic, or shallow. On the contrary, she considered herself an idealist, someone focused on the really important things in life. True happiness, true love. As she saw it, she was simply being honest with herself. And someone who really loved her would be the kind of person who would stop at nothing to help her overcome the trauma of her youth. Her mother's cheap fashion accessories, those fake pearls, those 9-carat gold amethyst rings. Someone who really loved her would understand and appreciate how profoundly she needed a house, not an apartment, preferably with a swimming pool, in addition to business class jaunts to 5-star resorts in the Caribbean and Hawaii. And she's this way throughout the entire book. She never grows at all or learns any lessons. There are a couple of times she comes close to almost getting, like, for example, she is supposed to be overseeing this French chef who's preparing a big meal when they're welcoming her new best friend and her husband to the community, but she is barely steps into the kitchen to watch what he's doing at all, and he slips creme fraiche into everything, including meat dishes, which is a huge no-no for the kosher rules. And all she does is, she finds one piece of meat that was not dressed yet, and she takes it into her husband, and she scrapes as much of the sauce off of her own squab as she can, but she basically lets all these other good people, well, they're not really good people, but in this context that they're being tricked and they don't deserve to be, they're eating unknowingly kosher food. I mean, obviously almost every kosher kitchen you've eaten in has had some kind of mistake, and they don't broadcast it because they don't want to embarrass people or make them, cast suspicions on your level of religiosity, because sometimes mistakes just happen. But she should have at least, said something, even if this was a horrible thing that was, being revealed about herself, and how she totally let the ball drop. And at another point later on, it turns out her husband is officiating at the bar mitzvah of a boy who is not Jewish according to Jewish law at all. His mother was not Jewish. She baptized him as a baby. His father tried to wash it off over the faucet, but that doesn't do anything if your mother is not Jewish, regardless of, whether you were formally converted to Christianity or not. You are not Jewish yourself unless you undergo a conversion. And so that's just and she doesn't tell it to her husband at all. That was just, horrible. And here's another passage in his book. And I should mention, if you're not familiar with Orthodoxy or Judaism or Jewish life, a lot of these things in the book might come across really unflattering to you. I mean, I know there are specific roles for the sexes in Orthodoxy, including liberal modern Orthodox, just like the so-called Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox life. But if you don't, understand the reasons and the historical context and developments and such for these rules, you might think, oh, this is really, really horrible, when it makes perfect sense if you study the laws and actually live in the community. So it seems kind of like Orthodox bashing, which I didn't really get from Ms. Ragen's other books, even when these women are really chafing at the bit and oh, I want more freedom. I still love Orthodoxy very much. I would never leave my community, but there are just some things that are very difficult for me to digest and learn to live with, and I just, can't get answers to these problems I'm having because I haven't been, given the tools to learn about this or feel empowered to ask and such. And here's another one. The mere sound of the Yiddish term Rebbitzin, a rabbi's wife, filled her with distaste and dread, conjuring up images of overweight Jewesses in bad wigs, wearing dowdy calf-length skirts and long-sleeved polyester blouses. She remembered the rabbis' wives who had been her teachers in yeshiva high school, those mirthless paragons of virtue, dedicated to squeezing out and discarding the last ounce of joy from living, the way you squeeze the sweet orange, leaving behind only the empty bitter shell, God, 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 and more God, combined with a life of doing hesed, good deeds, i.e., distasteful and inconvenient favors for ungrateful people you hardly knew and who would never reciprocate. That was the ideal of Jewish life, according to her pious teachers, who, if they had had a magic wand, would have waved it over all 20 of them as they sat in class, turning their clothes navy blue, their hair into long braids, and their thoughts to bearded rabbinical students who would touch them only 2 weeks out of the month until they got pregnant, and then it was anybody's guess. Only Rebbitzin Hamesh, her teacher for Jewish thought, filled her with admiration, while she viewed her with pity her excess weight, her stiffly sprayed, formally coiffed wigs, and her matronly clothes and thick ankles. She nevertheless found her witty and charming in a pale-lipped, pious way. Delilah was certain Rebbitzin Hamesh would wind up in heaven with a rich reward. Here's another one. And then the service was over, and the people filed out as fast as their canes and walkers would allow them, navigating the staircase to the first-floor social hall, where gray-haired ladies in old-fashioned hats had laid out paper plates with various types of herring and gefilte fish, stabbed with toothpicks, plates of dull sponge cake, and stale-looking Stella d'Oro cookies that smelled of anise. No one touched the food until the old rabbi arrived, pouring the red sweet Malaga wine, so thick you could cut it with a knife, into a silver cup, making the kiddush benedictions over it. That taken care of, the ladies brought out steaming platters of brown potato, kugel, and cholent, a dark meat and bean stew cooked overnight, which had enough fat in it to clog the last open space in any artery, still actually allowing blood to pass through. And this is when Delilah and her husband Chaim inherit a congregation from his grandpap in the Bronx. He's poised to take over as the rabbi. He agreed to go to rabbinical school if he did this, and his grandpap would totally pay for his tuition. But it's almost entirely geriatric people, and Delilah is constantly like making cheap jokes about them and complaining about them and insulting them. So she's basically, well, she's originally lovingly welcome in the community, but when it becomes clear she really doesn't like these people at all, they start turning on her and like noticing little things about her. Like, for example, she doesn't cover her hair in the proper way, and her skirts are too short, and her clothes are like too hip hugging and things like that. And so, a little over 5 months after Chaim's shirt button sermon, as they were walking home after yet another Shiva call, they'd been averaging 1 or 2 a month, Delilah turned to her new husband and said, "I can't stand this anymore." Chaim looked at his new bride, astonished. "What's wrong?" She turned her ring around her finger nervously. "What's right? This shul is falling apart, and the people are going with it. It's going to bury us alive. And this crumbly apartment in this old building, the Bronx, and the polluted air. I want my own house, a backyard for the children." And she's, constantly complaining about life in the Bronx gets so beneath her. The only place in the Bronx she thinks is worthwhile is Riverdale. And she does have a degree in being a dental hygienist, but for the longest time she doesn't work in that field because, I just want my hubby to take care of me and I won't have to, pay my way through anything. And earlier in the book, she has a romance, like not really secret, but like the true extent of it is like kind of secret, or at least she believes so, with a bad boy who's not really one the proper Orthodox girls want to date. And she has a pregnancy scare, and she, is like having a moment of panic. "Oh, I want to reform my life and start over and become more religious and do everything properly." And her roommate Rivki tells her, "Oh, go to shul and pray and talk to God. That always makes me feel better." But the shul is locked, so she goes to a movie theater instead, showing a Star Wars film, and it's, so dark and the surround sound is so loud, she figures no one will hear her, notice her praying, and she, just starts praying for a miracle to turn her life around. And then she either has like a miscarriage or her late menstrual period finally arrives, but like her reformation and conversion doesn't really last long. She's back to being like a whining complainer after this, and like doesn't really learn any lessons at all. If you were the rabbi's wife, you always had to have a chesed project. Feed the hungry, visit the sick. The more time-consuming and distasteful, the more worthy the project. So far she had resisted anything with hospitals. Chaim got stuck with all the sick calls, considering that the entire congregation practically took weekly vacations in Mount Sinai, the way other people went to Florida. He spent endless times in sick rooms. They had been after her to do the old age homes, the open-mouthed snorers sitting in their diapers and wheelchairs, the mumbling, insistent ones who grabbed you and made you their slaves. "Get me this, pick up that, wheel me there." She wasn't going back to the Moscovitz Hebrew Geriatric Center, only one afternoon, and it had taken her 3 shampoos to get the smell out of her hair. She liked kids well enough. She offered to find some Jewish ones and do something with them. She began by making a few phone calls, asking for advice from the president of the sisterhood, who liked her. She got a list of names and went about calling them, asking if they'd like her to join them the next time they went shopping. That's not what they wanted. What they wanted was for her to pick up their shopping lists and do their shopping for them. So, after work, she hurried to make dinner, then ran down to pick up their lists. Then she took the car and drove from store to store, buying farina and canned green beans and metamucil, standing in lines and carrying heavy brown bags to the car. And, of course, she brought the wrong green beans, the ones with salt. They all had salt except for one brand, sold in a little health food store, where it was impossible to find parking. In the end, the old biddy even refused to pay for it. "I'll just have to throw it out. All that salt could increase my Lenny's blood pressure. Is that what you're trying to do? Give him a heart attack? What kind of help is this anyway?" Without telling anyone, she stopped picking up the shopping lists. Chaim was deluded with phone calls from outraged congregants who had immediately gotten used to the idea of having a personal shopper and were now furious at having their old lives back. "You work for the shul, not me. I quit," she told him when he protested. "You go search all over town for low-sodium vegetables." Being left with no choice, he came to a compromise, offering to drive them around to their stores. But this meant he needed the car, and Delilah would have to take the subway to work. She was furious. It wasn't just the preparations that were driving her crazy. During one sisterhood meeting, she'd found two women in her bathroom discussing the hair dye, prescription medication they'd found in her medicine cabinet. At another, a woman she hardly knew told her that her baby was looking much better than when he was born, when he'd been like the puppy in the litter you throw away. After another, she'd found a silver cake server missing, and then a whole Wedgwood plate. And then there was the woman who had asked all kinds of personal questions about Chaim, finally admitting that her first rabbi had been touchy-feely Moishi from New Jersey, who had had his wife killed by a hitman, and her second, a rabbi in Florida, who had been arrested as a pedophile, so she was just trying to make sure it wasn't her fault the third time around. And in between, day and night, there were the phone calls, bring, day in and day out. The woman who called them at 1 a.m. to complain that her little Lenny had been traumatized by getting a donut with pink icing at the Oneg Shabbat party. The man who was incensed that the Lion of Judah giving category in the latest United Jewish fundraising campaign was between $20,000 and $40,000, leaving those who are just as pious but not as rich out in the embarrassing cold. Could the rabbi deal with that? Can you give the rabbi a message? Can you remind him? Can you talk to him about it? Could you possibly mention that in his last sermon he spoke too long, too short, about a topic we don't care about, but not to that extent, in that way? Can he talk about 12-year-old girls getting nose jobs in time for their bat mitzvahs? Can he talk less about Israel, more about Israel? Can he stop supporting the right-wing fanatics who won't compromise, who will get the Jewish people wiped off the planet? Can he stop supporting left-wing fanatics, Israeli peace nuts, who are giving in to our enemies and are going to get us wiped off the planet? Can he stop putting so much pressure on our young people, who are going to wind up with black hats and beards, unemployed and with 10 kids? Can he put more pressure on our young people, who are going to be drug addicts and get lost in rave parties in India? Blah, 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 like she actually had nothing better to do than to consult with Chaim on his boring sermons. And then there were the phone calls that were actually for her. A cousin of a synagogue member, a very nice 32-year-old girl with a good job as an editor at a big New York publishing firm, was looking for a very attractive lawyer or doctor who was also Orthodox but open-minded. Would she know of somebody suitable? Could she set it up? Gee, honey, if I knew anybody suitable who matched that description, why would I give him to you? I'd take him myself, she thought. Not right now, but let me write down the information, she'd answer sweetly, making no effort to get a pencil. Why bother? Go find a modern Orthodox man in his 30s who wasn't holding out for a girl, who would think as highly of him as his mother, looked like Kate Winslet, was as saintly as the matriarch Sarah, had the domestic skills of Martha Stewart. Listen, she wanted to shout at these men. The girls are all 5'2", dark-haired teachers or social workers who will never cook you a kreplach or kiss your feet the way your mother did. Get over it. And then there were the men who couldn't wait to get married, who would marry anyone, the divorced men, the stingy, over or undersexed grouches with bad tempers, body odors, and hanging bellies full of brisket and donuts, who had already made one woman miserable, but were anxious to make it two. They too were on the phone, seeking her help. Chaim looked down at the letter in his hand, undecided. Finally, he shrugged and left the room. He didn't say another word to her until dinner, at which time he finished his veal cutlet, wiped his lips, and placed his knife and fork on his plate with careful precision. This, he told Delilah, has got to stop. Delilah, you've got to talk to the Shamanovs. What exactly do you want me to say to them? That they have to invite the entire shul? What, are we in 4th grade? They'd have to charter 3 more planes and pay for 3 times the food. This bar mitzvah is destroying the community. People are bitter and jealous, and they hold us responsible. Us? What do you mean? Well, after all, it was you who brought the Shamanovs into the community in the first place. You are the one who decided which of our neighbors would be invited to their home and to ours. I invited the people who have been nice to us. And the board. Exactly. You invited all the big shots and left out the ones who are just ordinary, good-hearted, hard-working members of my congregation. This, of course, was absolutely true. She left out the wig wearers, the day school PTA moms, the makeup-free mikveh stalwarts, and the yentas with complaints. Delilah wasn't interested in the boring accountants and lawyers and Hebrew teachers, but then neither were the Shamanovs. When Joy had asked for her help in deciding the guest list, she'd seen it as a perfect opportunity to eat at the Schleppers and put together a wonderful weekend with fun people who knew how to enjoy themselves without putting everyone, Reed, the rabbi's wife, on a big guilt trip for wearing a bikini or dancing or taking a swim. She'd suggested inviting women whom she thought would be amusing for Joy and, yes, for herself. Young women who were rich and thin and sexy and who wore their designer clothes well and would know what to do at a concert by the legendary rock stars who would no doubt be entertaining them, no expense spared. Imagine Mick Jagger with his sneer and swagger, or Ricky Martin with those hips just inches away from her. She just couldn't wait. And so basically throughout the entire book, Delilah is like this whiny, childish complaining, only thinking material things, or people who she can have fun with. As I did mention, the satire is really, really over the top. There didn't seem to be a lot of nuance or like a reasonable contrast with them. Like, for example, maybe if they'd spent more time with people like Rivki and her husband Josh, who are actually normal, or Delilah's old friend Sippy, who turns out to be a lesbian and comes to an event with her partner, and then feels like put on the spot. Oh, we have to leave early because no one is making us feel welcome. And instead of just saying, oh, focusing on these horrible, terrible, shallow, like babyish, materialistic, awful, terrible people the entire time, because there's no real like contrast to them to really bring out the satire. And like, as I mentioned, like for example, her maiden name, her birth surname is Goldgrab, so it's like totally not subtle at all. And the Viktor Shamanov, who is the husband of Joy, his native republic is actually called Turkestan. Like, seriously, who's going to find that funny? A 12-year-old boy? That's not satirical. That's just really, kind of stupid. And also, like, a lot of holes in the plot. And also, when she discusses the Sota ritual, when a woman accused of adultery would have her hair uncovered in the temple, and she would be made to drink a potion of bitter waters with the holy name of God, the tetragrammaton Yud-He Vav-He, ground up, and like if she was innocent of adultery, she would be blessed with children and her husband would return to her, and if she was guilty, her stomach was exploded. And it said like this like never really happened. No woman accused of adultery ever had her stomach explode, because they were all innocent, obviously accused by jealous husbands. But anyway, Ms. Ragen says this happens in Leviticus, and no, it happens in Numbers in the Torah, and just like a few other things here and there, like misrepresenting things. And many times it feels like she's using her own authorial voice to bash Orthodoxy, or just misrepresent things, which was kind of really surprising. And also, Joy is converted to Judaism, obviously not a problem at all. But when she and her husband's son from his first marriage are joining the congregation, why doesn't Chaim like ask them personal questions? Obviously, you're not going to spread it around the community, but just ask in privacy and total confidence, like, what is your Jewish status? Because you have to know these certain things if you count in a minyan, or you're having a bar mitzvah or something in Orthodoxy, or even in like most conservative or Reform synagogues. Like, oh, are both of your parents Jewish? Can we see a copy of their ketubah, their marriage certificate, to prove it? What kind of like conversion did you have? Have you been living a Jewish life? If your child is Jewish by patrilineal descent, have they had a conversion or been living an actively Jewish life? And like, Joy doesn't even know what the holiday of Sukkot is, or what the etrog, the citron, is, part of the 4 species years during that holiday. So it's like, why aren't they asking these people more questions about their background, instead of just welcoming them excitedly into the community because they're rich? And like the Swallow Lake, the suburban Connecticut community they moved to, it's just so shallow, and these people are just so rich beyond belief. They just don't treat anybody nicely. They were just absolutely horrible people. And the book kind of ends in media res. There's a short epilogue speculating, oh, this may or may not have happened to Delilah and Chaim after the community dissolved, but there's just no satisfying conclusion at all. And I wouldn't say I hated this book. I obviously read it all. I thought there were some funny scenes and stuff, but it kind of started wearing thin after a while, because it was just too much satire all at once, trying to do like way too many things. Like, for example, that's one of the issues I have with Charlie Chaplin's last starring role, the 1957 film King of New York. It's really, really funny, obviously, because he was a comedic genius, but he's just trying to take on too many targets at once and satirize all of them, instead of just picking like maybe like 2 or maybe 3 at absolute most, and then maybe like gently spoofing a couple of other things here and there, but not trying to like make a huge deal out of everything. Oh, we're going to focus on this and this and this and this and this, like 10 different targets of satire throughout the film, instead of just picking up like a handful of really, really good ones to focus on. And this book could have been so much better if it had just carefully chosen what it was going to spoof. And I mean, obviously, as I mentioned, you don't want a character who's like too perfect, because I hate reading about like annoying goodies, but I also don't like reading about people who are so morally irredeemable. And even like, for example, you can kind of get away with it more with young characters, like I do with my own characters who are younger. Like, you don't expect like a normal like 12-year-old or 8-year-old, or even like most teenagers to a certain extent, to be all like perfectly good and well behaved, because that's not an interesting character and that's not believable. Like, who can relate to a child, particularly like a child or a preteen, him or herself, but a child is like, oh yes, darling mommykins, yes, dear daddy, oh, I'm so sorry I was naughty, I don't like being naughty, how can I help you today, darling mama? Like, seriously, you can't relate to characters like that. But you also don't want them to be too like mean-spirited and boring and annoying. You just like want someone who's realistic, like both good and bad. And like, sometimes this character doesn't do things that are so nice, and sometimes they just are a little bit too good for words, but I'm sorry if I'm wrong, but it's just like Delilah was not a character I could root for or relate to because she was just like totally unnuanced and just I really do not recommend this book. I mean, I do recommend Ms. Ragen's other books. She's generally a much better writer than this, but this one just really kind of fell flat for me and left a bitter taste in my mouth. So thank you very much for watching to the end. Hopefully my next video will be a TBR of my June plans and also maybe something I'm planning for my channel content and for my writing as well. I would like to apologize to anyone who watched my previous video, the review of the Cecil B. DeMille film, The King of Kings, for the white noise. I didn't know until I listened to the playback that the iPad microphone had gone down again, so I would really like to apologize for that and for that annoying road noise coming from outside. So see you again very soon. Thanks. Bye.